Today is week 2 of our sermon series, our Bible study, all around the mysterious pathways of joy. Last week we looked at the mysterious pathway of joy that is found through grace. And this week we're going to be looking at the mysterious pathway of joy that's found through adversity. And really the character that we're thinking of from the Bible that we tie this into is from the book of Acts and then from really the majority of the rest of the New Testament. And that is the man who starts out as Saul of Tarsus and ends up being the Apostle Paul. When we first meet Saul, or Paul, he has probably the best pedigree of anyone in the story of the followers of Jesus. He has been raised in a family that has prominence. He is a Pharisee, which means he is part of the ruling power of the Jewish people. He has been educated by a man named Gamaliel, a man that was so well known as a teacher of the law that about 100 years after his death, the rabbis wrote in the Mishnah that when Gamaliel died, the glory went out of the Torah, because they said he was the greatest interpreter of the law that had ever existed. And so when we first meet Saul, he truly is at the top of his game. Everything is right, and he even has a new job, which is to hunt down this sect of Judaism, which are calling themselves Christian, or followers of Christ, or the followers of the Way, as they were known. And he's really doing a good job with that. He's very successful in this role. So it'd be easy to see where he would find joy in all of this success. But I don't know if I encounter him that way. And that really doesn't connect to our topic this week, which is joy through adversity. So where does the adversity come?
Well, I think you have to go back with Paul to that connection with those early years in religion, and particularly with the Pharisees. There were multiple parties kind of going on at the time of Jesus, and so the Pharisees were very conservative. They followed the law. They wanted to make sure the law was handled well.
Right.
They appreciated it.
Right.
And they liked that order. And then you had the Sadducees, which, the old phrase, they don't believe in the resurrection. That's why they're so Sadducee. They're a little bit more they interpret things a little bit more loosely.
Yeah.
And then you had the Essenes, which they created their own communities or communes, up in the hills, and
the Qumran community.
Yeah, the Qumran community. This very ethereal sort of theology. Yeah. And then you had the Zealots, who were ready to just start a war at any moment. Anybody. So Paul aligns himself with this very law-oriented group of people. And as we looked in our first session, there's this connection between the God of following the law that is never quite happy with you, never quite satisfied. It's never good enough, and the lack of grace that comes from that. And so Paul was one of these people who he followed the law wonderfully, but he never really experienced God's grace until he's walking down the road and literally blinded by God and God's grace. It was an amazing moment.
It is. I mean, he had been the keeper. There were 613 laws, and he was the keeper of those laws. He was the enforcer of those laws. He was checking off all of those boxes. But really, his life takes the turn where he experiences joy when he experiences grace, when the risen Christ appears to him and calls him basically on the carpet for persecuting the followers.
Yeah, and so all that life of checking the boxes, of living by the law, of being so strict in what was going on, never brought him joy. And then suddenly joy finds him, and that's why the title of the book is The Mysterious Pathways of Joy. Joy found him, grace found him, and suddenly his life was transitioned. So a lot of times what we see with people is that a sense of adversity can bring this on more quickly than anything. And you wouldn't expect that.
Right.
The last thing you expect is that, something horrible happened to me, therefore I found joy. But with Paul's life, the further you see him go in the grace of God, the more joy that we see him discover. The time you get to Philippians, he's there in a house jail, essentially. He's waiting on his execution. And the whole book is just filled with all these. You ought to rejoice. There's joy in this. And everybody would scratch their heads, except that somehow in the midst of that adversity, people often become aware of the grace of God more and the joy of God. And I'm sure we've had examples of that in all of our lives where joy kind of came at the least suspecting moment.
Right, right.
Well, it certainly has been that way especially in my personal faith life. In fact, I think sometimes you see joy more clearly when things aren't going well. My husband and I and another couple were in a terrible car wreck. I broke 13 bones, and I was in this plastic cast from my neck down to my waist. Lots and lots of pain. And I'll never forget, we had gotten home from the hospital. It was a Sunday night, and the doorbell rang, and 3 of our teenage girls from our youth group showed up. And I could hear him say to my husband, Mr. Mike, Mr. Mike, Mr. Mike, we know we're not supposed to be here, but we just had to come. Mr. Mike, can we see Miss Sherry just for a second? We know we're not supposed to be here. So I walked down the hall to see them, and it was the sweetest thing. They had bought me grocery store flowers, most in colors not found in nature. They had brought me coloring books and crayons and coloring pencils and those books where you find a word.
Oh, yeah.
And it brought me such joy in the midst of, I'm facing, 8 or 10 weeks of constant pain. And all of a sudden, these beautiful little 3 youth show up and gave me joy.
And that small act of grace.
Oh, absolutely.
Just opened that moment for you.
It really did. It certainly got me out of the pity party I was in at that moment.
And that's the way, the story of joy is that it sort of surprises you. And all of a sudden, in the least likely spot, there it is. When you look back at Christian history, there is a writer who lived in the 13th, 14th century. His name is St. John of the Cross. And he goes back to an earlier writer from the 6th century and picks up on this phrase called the dark night of the soul. And in that moment, we use that phrase to kind of mean depression. Well, they're in a dark night at the moment. Well, that's not really what he meant. The phrase really means you're sort of in a fog. And I love the earlier writer's words. The title of his book was called The Cloud of Unknowing. And so we are people who like to know things and like to have this clarity. And suddenly at moments in life, through adversity, there's not clarity. And there's this cloud that sort of filters into our lives. And so St. John talks about this cloud and these dark moments. But in the midst of those, there's incredible growth that happens. And it's kind of like I've learned, and I don't know a lot about plants, but I've learned that there's a lot that happens with roots of plants during the winter when you would think that everything's dormant. Underneath, the roots of those plants are growing and deepening. And so for St. John, these moments of adversity are moments that we grow very deep in our faith.
I think sometimes as pastors, people expect us to have this kind of perfect faith life. We never have doubts. We never have fears. We
don't, do we?
and we certainly never have a dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
But we do. And I think when you're in the midst of it, you don't understand it.
Right.
But when you look back, you see how deeply you grew with God during that period of time. 9 months after my sister died of congestive heart failure, my youngest son, Joshua, was diagnosed with the same disease. And his pumping rate, which was 11%, which basically means he could just, boom, be gone. And they had to put in an internal defibrillator and pacemaker. It was 3 weeks until they could do that. And every single night for 3 weeks, I would sneak into his room and make sure he was still breathing. Because this was my child, and it was my job to take care of my child, and I couldn't do it. And
just like a new mom.
That
sneaks in there and peeks into the cradle to see that the baby, you're back doing that.
I was back. I would have put my hand on his chest if I thought it would have woken him up. And when I actually told him that story, he said, "Mom, please don't tell anybody that. That's the creepiest thing I've ever heard."
Well, I'm glad we're recording it.
Yeah, yeah. But walking through that journey with him is, he went to one heart doctor after another, and trying to decide, are they going to put him on the heart transplant list? What is going to happen? All this. I remember early in the process, one of the doctors said, sometimes in young patients, the heart reverses itself. And I thought, no, it doesn't. I know better than that. It won't. It won't. And I had a lot of conversations with God, most of which were very loud on my side. I was very upset with God. But over a period of a year and a half, that's what happened. My son's heart healed itself. And not only did my son's heart heal itself, my relationship with God was healed as well and taken in a much deeper direction, because for the first time in my life as a mom, I couldn't fix it. I just had to depend on God sustaining us in that process, in that dark night of the soul.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I have when I was in high school, the pastor of our church was put in the hospital at UAB with heart failure and ended up on the transplant list. And when he had gone through the transplant and came out of the hospital, was back at the church, I would go over and I would help cut the grass at the parsonage, because he just really wasn't physically able to do that kind of work. And I remember sitting outside with him in the swing and having long conversations with him. It's part of what really, I think, prepared my soul to be called to ministry, was spending that time with him. But sitting there one day asking him, what came out? I know you got a new heart. You got the heart transplant. But what came out of this? That really, what's the biggest thing that changed in you, not just physically? Was there anything else that spiritually that changed, or what, thinking changed, emotional, and whatever? And he said, I think the greatest thing that came out of this is I have a deeper appreciation for prayer and deeper and greater joy that comes through praying, because I realized that if medical science healed me, then I was going to get a new heart. But for me to get a new heart, someone had to die. And he said, and it ended up being a firefighter in Arkansas that died and was a perfect match for him. He said, so I couldn't pray that through medical science I'd be healed. He said, but I've always been a person of prayer, but I left me out of the prayer. And he said, for 6 months in the hospital, I prayed for other people, and I prayed for our world, and I prayed for, he said, I prayed prayers of thanksgiving, and I prayed prayers of just true adoration of who God is and what God's about. And he said, and through all of that, I came out with this joy that is deeper than I'd ever known, because I truly learned how to pray in the darkest time of my life.
Wow.
And I think Paul got there as he was, he eventually got in trouble with the Jewish leaders and put into the Roman system. He found himself really facing death and facing the end of his life, but yet he realized that he had this increasing ministry. He was able to go around the world, and he was preaching to kings and to leaders of places, and he had these disciples that were developing that would come and visit him, and they could come and go, and they were going across the world, and they're bringing back all these good reports. And so for Paul, though his life looked like it was going to be brief, he realized that his influence and what God was doing through his adversity was enormous. And so he found a distinctly deep sense of joy in the midst of that.
Right. I mean, if you look at his story, where we left off talking about him being Saul and then converted and being Paul, I mean, he does amazing things. The modern church really is crafted after the teachings and the writings of Paul. And yet he was beaten and thrown into prison. Shipwrecked and beaten and thrown into prison. And
I'm seeing a pattern develop here. Yeah.
Beaten and thrown into prison. It seemed to be the way it went. But in the midst of all that, Paul writes, not a lamentation, not some kind of dirge, not some kind of woe is me, but instead Paul writes, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, so you clear on this, I say rejoice. That's a joy that comes from somewhere else, and from someone else.
You know, there's a writer named Gerald May who passed away a few years ago. He was a psychiatrist and spiritual director and wrote a number of books. One of them was on St. John of the Cross.
Mm-hmm.
And in his introduction, he talks about how he had been diagnosed with cancer and how terrible a thing that was, and that he had experienced a treatment that saved his life, and how great a thing that was. But the treatment that saved his life destroyed another organ, and how terrible that was. And then he was on the transplant list, and how in the midst of that process he had deepening relationships with people, and how good that was. And so he said, there's a certain point in our lives where we can't predict what experiences of life are going to bring good things or bad things.
Yeah.
We think we do.
Oh, yeah.
We have a plan, and we want God to, endorse our plan. But some of the most surprising places bring joy, and some of the places that we thought ought to bring joy simply don't. And so he said by the time he got to that stage in his journey, he quit trying to predict it. And he just began to live in a sense of grace. And I think Paul did that, and I pray that all of us can find a way to do that.
Absolutely.